This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 47 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, November 19th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. The stores of Wright and Fletcher and J. Herbert Fletcher will close hereafter at 7:30 on Tuesday evenings, as well as on Thursday evenings. The townspeople will bear in mind that as soon as the evening mail is sorted and delivered on these evenings, the stores will be closed. A Wright and Fletcher store was on Main Street. It's now the same facility that Muffins on Main is located in. And the J. Herbert Fletcher store was on Lincoln Street, where the Connery and Insurance Company is now located. They each served as the post office, depending on whether a Republican or a Democrat was president. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Howard and their little son John of Concord, New Hampshire, have recently enjoyed a few days' stay with Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Howard. Charles was Calvin's son. Mrs. William Sutherland's many friends are glad that she has recovered from her recent serious ill turn. Edward Hamlin is able to be out and at work again after being disabled several weeks with a badly injured eye. While cutting glass, a sliver flew and struck the eyeball. Later, a bad abscess formed, causing much pain and inconvenience, and the care of a local Lowell eye specialist. Miss Grace Lumbert returned last week from Littleton, where she has been in her professional capacity, and went the following day to Oxford to be gone several weeks. She was a nurse, and she seemed to have traveled around the area a fair amount. A recent enterprise of the ladies of the Congregational Church was to supplement the work of the faithful janitor with a general cleaning day. Paint, windows, etc. received some thorough attention, and Elliot Humiston demonstrated the efficiency of his new vacuum cleaner by going over the entire surface of the church carpet, removing a great amount of fine dust. The Congregational Church was what we now call the CPA on Lincoln Street. Mr. and Mrs. W.M. Wright have entertained as their initial guest in their new home Mrs. Wright's father, Cyrus Hosmer of Wakefield, for several days. Cyrus Hosmer formerly lived in Westford and was elected one of the original 7 trustees of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Graniteville when it was formed in 1869. Through the courtesy of Superintendent L.H. Cushing of the Lowell and Fitchburg Street Railway Company, the Westford patrons are not to be debarred from all evening service between the center and Brookside. Mr. Cushing has arranged with the selectmen to have a late Saturday night car from Brookside to Westford Center, the fare to be 20 cents for the round trip to Brookside. This plan is to be put into operation for the first time this Saturday evening, November 19th, and if $2 can be realized for each round trip, it will be continued in operation. Mrs. John B. Fletcher has closed her house and gone for the winters to stay with her niece, Mrs. Edith Fletcher Wilson of Chelmsford. The old First Parish Church is completing its improvements by installing the town water supply. The house occupied by Mrs. Lillian Lumbert was also equipped in like manner last week. Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth went to Cambridge last Saturday for the Dartmouth-Harvard football game, and afterward went to Winchester and spent Sunday with the Henry Hildreths. Charles L. Hildreth was a 1901 graduate of Dartmouth and seems to always go to the Dartmouth-Harvard games, especially when they're in Cambridge. The Thimble Club met with Mrs. William L. Woods in her pleasant new home on Wednesday afternoon. There was a good attendance, and true to its name, the members carried thimbles and worked on window draperies for their hostess. The total eclipse of the splendid harvest moon on Wednesday evening was much appreciated by the interested ones. The fine coppery tints were particularly in evidence. The newly installed telephone service for the south part of the town is completed, and the following families are enjoying the service: Mrs. Sarah Drew, A.H. Burnham, Augustus Bunce, Charles Bicknell, George Kimball, D.J. McLeod, Harry Nesmith, Fred Sherry. I think the name is actually Shorey, but it's spelled S-H-A-R-E-Y instead of S-H-O-R-E-Y. James Wilson, T.A.E. Wilson, and Irving West. The line for the Angus MacDonald and David Desmond families will soon be completed and ready for use. The official 1910 census figures, which have just been announced by the Census Bureau at Washington, give the town of Westford a population of 2,851, a gain of 227 people in 10 years, the population in 1900 being 2,624. A new basketball team has been organized by the Academy students under the direction of Principal Cogshell, which promises well for an interesting schedule of games. Next, we have an obituary of a distinguished Westford citizen. It is with a feeling of genuine sadness that the announcement went through the community on Monday of the death of Nahum Harwood Wright, who died November 4th. Mr. Wright was advanced in years and had not been in good health for a long time, and for the last 6 weeks had been confined to his room with heart trouble. Saturday he had suffered a bad attack, but had rallied somewhat, and at the last the end came suddenly. Nahum Harwood Wright was born in Littleton, September 15, 1831, being the fifth child in a family of 8 children of Ezekiel Conant and Susan Stevens Wright. He was educated in the public schools of Littleton and Lowell. In early manhood, he was for a number of years an engineer on the Boston and Lowell Railway, as it was then called. During this time, he met with a serious accident which nearly cost him his life, but after recovering from this, he continued in the capacity for about a year, when he took a change for a number of years of the milk car, which at the present time is managed by the D. Whiting and Sons Company. Mr. Wright was afterward associated with the late Arthur Wright in the grocery business at Graniteville, and later with the late Sherman D. Fletcher and his son, Sherman H. Fletcher, which for many years has been the firm of Wright and Fletcher. Mr. Wright's son, Howard L., who in later years was nicknamed Dick Wright, having succeeded him in the partnership when he retired a few years ago. Mr. Wright has lived for the past 40 years at Westford Center. He has filled many offices of trust and responsibility, that of selectman, and for 23 consecutive years held the office of town treasurer, resigning in 1909 when his son, Howard L., succeeded to the office. Mr. Wright was a member of William North Lodge of Masons, and also of the Pilgrim Commandery of Knights Templars of Lowell. He was married in 1857 to Miss Abby Livingston, who died January 24th, 1896. He is survived by 2 sons, Henry M. Wright of Quincy, principal of the English High School of that place, and Harwood J. Wright of this town, who succeeds his father in the firm of Wright and Fletcher. Also, 1 grandson, Livingston Wright. Mr. Wright was a man of sterling integrity in all his dealings, of innate courtesy and genial kindness, leaving to those who come after him a blessed heritage of upright manhood, and to the community a keen sense of loss for a good man gone from their midst. The next section is on the Tadmuck Club, the ladies' club at Westford Center. The regular meeting of the Tadmuck Club met in the vestry of the Congregational Church on Tuesday afternoon. This change of meeting place was for the availability of a piano for the musical numbers on the program that had been prepared. The program for the afternoon was the first in the series for the winter special study of Spanish North America, and was, quote, the Aztecs and Montezumas, end quote, with Miss Edith M. Lawrence as chairman. It took more than an unfortunately chilly vestry to cool the appreciation of the excellence of the two papers prepared, the first by Miss Lawrence on the Aztecs and the second by Miss Bertha H. Morris on the two Montezumas. From a wealth of material, Miss Lawrence and Miss Norris had culled the salient features of interest concerning these early dwellers of Mexico and their customs and their kings, Montezuma I and Montezuma II. The program was pleasingly interspersed with solos by Miss Winifred Burnham and Miss Adrith Carter, accompanied at the piano by Miss Julia Fletcher. At the next meeting, November 19th, Miss Edith Foster will continue the subject with a special topic, quote, Cuba and her neighbors under Spanish and American rule, end quote. Mrs. Thomas R. Fisher of Lowell has been admitted into membership in the club, and Mrs. Fred A. Sweat of Forest Village has had her name placed on the waiting list for the first vacancy. They had a limit on the number of members, and it changed with time. I think maybe around this time it was about 100 members. The next section is the Forge Village section. Services at St. Andrew's Mission will be held at 4:15 p.m. Sunday, November 20th, instead of 4:30 p.m., the usual hour in the past. Reverend A.L. Bumpus, the new pastor of the mission, was in the village during the week, making calls on his new parishioners. He was actually the parish priest at the Episcopal Church in Groton, and the Mission Church in Westford was a spin-off of that church, served by the same pastor. Batters have been put up for the 4 new cottages on Union Street, now East Prescott Street, to be built by the Abbott Worsted Company. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Thursday afternoon, and after the usual routine, a dainty and most enjoyable luncheon was served. The engagements are announced of the following young ladies of this village: Miss Janie Cotterell to Albert E. Jones of Worcester, Miss Rose Northrup to John Morton of Lowell, and Miss Elizabeth Orange to Ephraim Vickers of Providence, Rhode Island. Next, we have a report on a death. The funeral of Mrs. Ellen Cavanaugh, wife of William Cavanaugh, took place on Friday morning of last week from her home on Bradford Street at 8:30. A high mass was celebrated at St. Catherine's Church at 9 o'clock, and Reverend M.E. Doherty officiated. The choir, under the direction of Miss Mary F. Healy, I think that should actually be Hanley, sang the Gregorian chant. Burial was in St. Catherine's Cemetery. The bearers were John McNiff, Thomas May, James Burns, William Venn, and Thomas Finn. A large number of friends and neighbors were present at the church. Mrs. Cavanaugh came to this country from Keighley, England, with her husband and family 4 months ago, and her pleasing personality and quiet and gentle character won for her many friends. Especially sad will be the news of her death to relatives and friends of deceased in England, whom she left but a short time ago, and in the best of health. A husband and 10 children, the youngest but a few days old, are left to mourn her loss. There were quite a few people who came to Westford from Keighley, England. I think I, at one point, counted well over 100 as reported in the 1920 census, where it gives the place of birth of. No, that wouldn't give Keighley as the place of birth. I guess in my genealogy file where I keep track of that. A large number, anyway, from Keighley, England. The next section is the About Town section. The Edwin E. Haywood farm has been sold to a New Hampshire party who is not yet near enough the farm to be named. Just wait, and his name will appear in the Westford Directory, which is in charge of tax collector Leonard W. Wheeler. The price paid, as reported by authority, was $4,200. Mrs. Leonard Walker of Groton was a recent guest at the old Stand Pat Walker Homestead on Main Street. Reverend Mr. Bailey will exchange next Sunday with Reverend O.J. Fairfield of Littleton, who was recently of Ware. Charles W. Whitney on the Lowell Road has disposed of his milk route at West Chelmsford to William C. Edwards, Peter Lowell, and others. With favoring moons and stars, winds and roads, the fare of the old First Parish Church last week, Friday afternoon and evening, moved right along to $212 in net profit, which helps much towards much. Reverend Louis H. Buxhorn, a former minister, he was a minister from 1896 to 1899, was present at the fair and was much shaken by the tokens of unforgotten associations. Reverend Buxhorn would return to become pastor again from 1950 to 1919. The Roslindale Orchestra of Lowell did much lively work with musical instruments, and youthful townfolk did much lively work of a pretty twirl in answering to it. C.R.P. Decatur, as per order of the school committee, has moved the furnace in the Stony Brook School to the Nabnasset School. Better move the windows also. It will save much target shooting with the stones, accompanied by the small boys. Frederick A. Snow of West Chelmsford, of chilly name and genial fame, has added the telephone as an entertainer. This, with the recent baby boy carriage entertainer, makes life very much awake and desirable. He is now equipped to receive the messages and interpret them in terms of business, pleasure, or duty. Fred Snow was Samuel Taylor's son-in-law, and Samuel wrote this part of the Westford Wardsman, the About Town section. Parkerville and rural suburbs are still without rapid transit, but the newly installed telephone provides them with rapid means of talking, and 13 families have gone at it on line 36. Another death is reported in the next section. Many residents in town will be saddened to learn that the sudden death in New York City of Mrs. Isidore F. Virgin. She was the wife of Reverend Samuel H. Virgin, Doctor of Divinity, who for many years was minister of the Congregational Church in Harlem, New York. For many years, their summer residence had been in West Chelmsford at the homestead of her father, the late William Blodgett, and where about 10 years ago they built the spacious new house. In the delightful summer days, they were almost daily seen on the wooded roads of Westford by trout brook and lake. The next paragraph is called Recount. The Board of Registrars met on Monday evening at the Selectmen's Room to recount the votes for Congressman from the 4th District and Senator from the 7th District as petitioned for by disappointed candidates. George T. Day and Charles L. Hildreth represented Mr. Wilder, and Lawyer O'Sullivan of Lowell represented Mr. Mitchell. In the senatorial count, John A. Healy of Graniteville represented candidate Keeley of Lynn, and the Board of Registrars represented candidate Bennett of Saugus. The recount revealed no material change from the returns of the election of officers. Both candidates for Congress lost one vote each for the long term. By the recount, Wilder has 194 for the long term and 195 for the short term. Mitchell has 144 for the long term and 159 for the short term. Lawyer O'Sullivan contested 8 votes for Wilder. For the recount for Senator, the returns of the election officers was confirmed. And the last section is entitled An Old Historic Church. The dedication of the memorial window to be placed in the First Parish Church, the gift of Colonel Edwin D. Metcalf in memory of his mother, will take place on Sunday afternoon, November 27th, it being the anniversary of the organization of the church and ordination of the first minister, Reverend Willard Hall, on November 27th, 1797. That was actually 2 years before the town of Westford was incorporated as a town. This old historic church, with its gilded spire ever pointing towards greater light, has stood the ebb and flow in the problems of faith, discipline, and finance. Then there's a quote, "And having done all, stand," end quote, which is a quote from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13. Reverend E.A. Horton of Boston, of Fragrant Westford Academy Memories, will give the address. Reverend Edward Augustus Horton was born in 1843 and died in 1931, and he became a trustee of Westford Academy in 1871. He was well known in Westford. The choir are rehearsing special music and will be assisted by Albert E. Prescott of Boston. Colonel Metcalf will also be present and add to the effectiveness of Memory's tribute. Colonel Metcalf had previously donated the Civil War Memorial in memory of his father to the town on Memorial Day in 1910. That's the news in Westford for the week ending November 19th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at westford.museum.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.